Welcome back. We're discussing the carbon emissions trading system and asking how well it works. Now, you can contact us with your thoughts at the numbers at the bottom of your screen. Joining me from London is Larry Lohman from the environmental think tank Corner House, also Imtiaz Ahmed, a carbon trader at Morgan Stanley, and here in Washington, D.C. is David Hunter, the Director of U.S. Policy for the International Emissions Trading Association. And David Hunter, I've got to ask you, if some of Larry Lohman's arguments are basically that carbon trading gets in the way, there are alternatives. I wonder, when we look at the idea of renewable energy, if there is a carbon trading system in place, how much of a disincentive it may be for people to look at alternatives such as renewable energies?
Riz, I don't think it's a disincentive at all. And in fact, I think that Larry is missing the big picture. You can have as many local initiatives as you want, and you should have local initiatives, but ultimately you need a strong national cap. The government, the federal government, has to say that the United States as a whole is going to cap emissions at this level and then reduce them to this level. And in contrast, I do not see that getting in the way of local initiatives. I see that as providing encouragement and spurring local initiatives, which will spur renewable energy.
Again, an email question to you that came from Stuttgart in Germany. Thomas wrote in saying, if the fight against pollution becomes a traded commodity, isn't everyone working towards their own financial interests rather than the good of the environment?
Well, Riz, I think that's a point, is that we want people to have a financial interest in protecting the environment. Right now, people can pollute as much as they want for free. There's no cost on it. But those actions, polluting, it has a cost. It has an impact. And that impact has to be incorporated into the system. So if you're going to continue emitting carbon dioxide, you should have to pay for the environmental consequences of that. And that's what cap and trade is about.
Imtiaz Ahmed, one of the criticisms about the system is that it's big business that's able to buy its way out of responsibility. The other is that it's the brokers who get the fees who are really benefiting from this. And obviously I want to give you a chance to defend yourself being on that side of it, and ask really to what extent the system is stabilizing such that people know what they're doing within that carbon trading system.
Sure, Riz. Maybe if I could give the example of the clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. And when people say large businesses are trying to buy their way out, and we talk about renewable energy, for example, well, the clean development mechanism allows companies that have compliance obligations under the EU trading system to purchase offsets from projects that are approved and authorized and audited under a UN authorized system. And many of these technologies they're deployed essentially in China and India and other countries, Brazil, who do not have a ceiling on their emissions, and where emissions growth is very rampant, especially as energy demand and energy consumption grows very aggressively as the economies of India, China, Brazil emerge very strongly. Well, the clean development mechanism allows a transfer and deployment of technology, for example, renewable technology. Many of the CDM projects, that's clean development mechanism, that are being deployed in those countries are increasingly now renewable technologies. And the transfer is deployed, there's a transfer of technology deployed, there's sustainable development advantages, and then companies with compliance obligations in the EU are effectively funding them, or indeed banks such as Morgan Stanley and our rivals are getting engaged in helping develop those projects. No. However, it's not money for free as such, because there is a lot of risk in those projects. There is credit risk, there is performance risk, so the private sector is putting up capital, deploying it in the fight against pollution, generating credits that they can then sell into the compliance system. But it is not a riskless system.
Right. Can I ask you how you feel about the idea, Imtiaz, how do you feel about the idea of auctioning carbon credits rather than directly selling them? That's something that's been suggested here in the US.
Sure, and also in the EU, they are increasingly looking at for post-2012, which is the phase 3 period, that will run 2013 to 2020, to impose a very high level of auctioning on the power generation sector. You mustn't forget the EU emission trading scheme was an early mover. It was the only cap and trade system for carbon introduced. And so there's been a gradual move to auctioning for the power generation sector, but they're talking about full auctioning post-2012. Now, I personally believe that could be a good thing, especially in the power generation sector, in particular because the utilities, they can pass on the cost to the power price. They're incentivized fully to respond to the carbon price in their generation mix as well. And when Larry was stating earlier that carbon trading doesn't incentivize, for example, renewable generation, I don't think that's necessarily true. It should certainly incentivize power generators to dispatch the cleanest possible generation that they have to displace the dirtiest generation. And if the time frames set are long enough, it should incentivize generation into cleaner and cleaner forms of technology.
Okay.
Take the UK as an example. The average UK coal-fired generator emits 0.9 to 1 tons of carbon dioxide for every 1 megawatt hour of electricity generated. A new gas-fired generation plant, a new one built today, would emit 0.3 to 0.35 tons of carbon dioxide for every 1 megawatt hour of electricity generated. That's nearly a 3-to-1 saving. And indeed, if renewable energy was built in the form of wind or hydro, that's zero carbon being emitted.
Let me ask.
So companies can save those emission credits.
All right, Imtiaz, let me ask Larry Lohman about the idea. I mean, to respond to some of these issues that you and David Hunter have brought up, but also ask Mr. Lohman, would you be comfortable with the idea of a carbon tax rather than a carbon credit trading system?
Well, I mean, first let me just address a couple of the points that have been raised so far. I mean, I think David pointed out that a cap imposing a limit on a society's emissions should not be incompatible with local initiatives, and of course I agree. But I think the problem is that carbon trading, emissions trading, does not just consist of a cap. It consists of a cap and trade. And the trade is actually what slows down the development of renewable energy. It allows the worst offenders. It allows the industries where change has to happen crucially. For example, power generators. For example, cement, chemicals, iron and steel, oil and gas. It allows those heavily fossil-intensive industries to delay action by buying credits from somewhere else or buying permits from somewhere else, and that slows down the change where it's needed the most. So I think there's a misunderstanding there about the CDM question. I think it's factually incorrect to say that CDM is now supporting a lot of renewable energy. In fact, what the CDM is doing, the Clean Development Mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol, that is, what it's doing now is it's actually providing extra money for heavily polluting industries, usually in the global south, to continue business as usual, and at the same time to sell carbon pollution rights or pollution permits to the industrialized north so that they can also continue pollution as usual. If you look at the profile of CDM projects, you don't find very much renewable energy. What you find are very clever schemes, for example, of bolting extra machinery onto a refrigerant plant to capture and destroy these very potent hydrofluorocarbon gases, which create massive numbers of carbon credits, but actually don't do anything to put a southern society like India or like China onto a renewable path.
A quick thought, Mr. Lohman, what do you feel about the idea of a carbon tax then?
I think taxes certainly have a role, but taxes, like other price mechanisms, are not useful unless you have alternatives that people can turn to. I mean, if you're going to tax me for doing something that's bad for the environment, like driving a Mercedes-Benz, unless you give me a choice that I can turn to, if you tax me to disincentivize me from using my Mercedes-Benz, then it's going to be very difficult for me to change. If you don't give me the public transport systems, if you don't give me a choice, then the price mechanism has limitations. That's nothing to say. That's not to argue against a carbon tax. It's just to say that it has to take its place in a context of structural change, which has to be achieved by other means than trading. Okay, David Hunter, the idea of an alternative like our carbon tax, let's get your view on that. And secondly, when it comes to policing quotas and so on, how effective is the policing process?
Okay, well, first off, on a carbon tax, the trouble with a carbon tax is it does not provide environmental certainty. The objective is to say we're going to reduce our emissions by an amount that society and the scientists say we need to reduce them in order to protect the planet. And that's what a cap does. It puts in place a number and says, okay, everybody has to get to this number. A tax doesn't do that. A tax makes it more expensive. It raises the price that we pay for electricity, raises the price that we pay for gasoline, but it doesn't guarantee any environmental result. So I don't think that a tax is a good solution.
So 30 seconds, a quick thought on the policing. Is there an effective policing to make sure people with the quota system and trading system will be effective?
Well, I think the CDM is effective. I think there were a few initial problems with it, but I think it is effective. But ultimately what we need is to pass global legislation in the US, but bringing in all countries to set up a new system that will be cap and trade around the world.
All right. David Hunter, thank you very much. Larry Lohman and Imtiaz Ahmed, thank you for joining us as well. And thank you for being with us as our viewers. On the next show, we're looking at the humanitarian political crisis in Somalia. Join us with your thoughts and your questions and comments. We'll see you next time.